like the benefits of nuclear energy, weaponry outweigh like the potential dangers of like causing like a potential like world like.
Um, okay. If you ask the question, if you could somehow have redone the world so that nuclear energy and nuclear weapons were not possible, but leave everything else the same, which is, of course, would it have been better if it had not been possible? Almost certainly yes. Nuclear power is certainly a mixed blessing. At the moment, there's certainly been some major nuclear accidents, Chernobyl principally. Probably you can make the case that nuclear power has been a net good. And maybe you can make the case that nuclear power will become an increasing good, weirdly, as an environmentally conscious way of going forward. I say weirdly because people of my generation tend to think of nuclear power as the environmentally awful thing and the radiation, blah, blah, blah. But it doesn't cause global warming. Yeah. However, nuclear weapons are a much more complicated thing. And again, I can give you the good news and the bad news version of it. The good news is that because nuclear weapons are so terrible, there have not been any major world wars since World War II. And the notion that nuclear weapons might lead to peace was perverse. Probably the first person to articulate this view was Niels Bohr, actually. But his thought was not that we live in a world that we currently do, but that it was so terrible that we would have to learn to establish international conventions different than what we have. That the United Nations, blah, 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 would somehow manage to oversee nuclear power and that countries would renounce nuclear weapons. It didn't happen. But it's also true that, at the height of the Cold War, the U.S. and the Soviet Union didn't get along real well, right? And yet there was no major outbreak of war in Europe. There were wars in Korea and Vietnam, some other places which were proxy wars in some sense for the United States and the Soviet Union. But there was always care to prevent them from turning into all-out war. So far, you can argue that nuclear weapons have made the world safer in the last half-century. The problem, of course, is that it's making it safer because it's so horrible if such a war started. And what are the odds that we will continue not to have nuclear war for the next, your lifetime and then your children's lifetime and so on? And what's complicated is that nuclear weapons are not such a difficult thing to do. Part of Niels Bohr's argument is that there is no secret of the atomic bomb. It's nature lets you do it. And the fact of the matter is, North Korea, which we should note can't feed its population, has built nuclear weapons. Okay, crappy nuclear weapons, but and so the question is whether, as more and more states acquire the ability to do it, the world will become unstable and dangerous. And that's a scary enough prospect that I would say, on the whole, this has not been good for the world. Although to date it has been, right? So at least I think it has been.
Yeah. And were the Germans when they were the first to split the atom, right?
Well, as I say, the Italians were actually. They just didn't know they had done it, but yes.
Yeah. And then were they actually close to?
No, they were not close at all.
Okay.
For various reasons. One of them, of course, is they threw out half of their good scientists, maybe more. Right. For example, the head of theory at Los Alamos was Hans Bethe. Now, Bethe was clearly German, and when I say this, I don't mean just that he was of German nationality, but he thought of himself not as Jewish, but as German. Indeed, I think his family had converted to Lutheranism. But because of this kind of ideological, racial view of the Nazis, They threw out people like Beta. They threw out people like all the Hungarians who were living there, like von Neumann and Teller, blah, blah, blah. The other thing was that, so Heisenberg was actually in charge of their program, and they fucked up. I mean, that's the basic thing. They made some technical mistakes. So, for example, in building reactors, they got wrong whether or not you could use carbon as a moderator, which meant that they thought they had to use heavy water. The only place they could get heavy water was a place with good hydroelectricity. There was a plant in Norway that made the stuff. We kept blowing it up, and so they never managed to get reactors built. They never realized that nuclear bombs really were possible. And we know this. It's not just something that we're speculating, because after the war, we rounded up the majority of top nuclear scientists in Germany and detained them in a very polite way in a country home in Britain, Farm Hall. And there were people like Otto Hahn, and Heisenberg, and so forth, von Weizsäcker. And the thing that was amusing was that we bugged them. And they didn't quite realize they were being bugged. In fact, somebody said, "You think they're recording what we're saying?" And Heisenberg said, I think it was Heisenberg, but one of them said, "Oh, come on, the English are much too polite. They would never go in for these Gestapo-like methods, right?" So it was pretty clear that what they were saying was candid. And we have on record what they said to each other after the news of the bomb at Hiroshima happened. And they were shocked. They didn't think it was possible. Originally, when they were told about it, they thought it was a fraud, and they only believed it when they heard it on BBC radio, and then they started talking among themselves and what they had missed and so forth. So they were not close.
Because that was like it said in one of these videos that we watched. That was like main fueling point. But
Well, no. So it is certainly true that if you go back to 1939 and you ask why did we do it, and many of the people pushing for it, like Leo Szilard, were people who you might have thought had real moral qualms about doing it, but the real reason you did it was you were worried that Germany would do it. And Germany was the leading scientific country in the world before 1933, unquestionably. And so it was a race. It's just we didn't realize when the other side stopped racing.
and then